Well, good morning, everybody, for the fifth, I think, Hong Kong Free Press live stream interview. Today we have Doreen Weisenhaus, who's a senior lecturer with a joint appointment at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law and Medill School of Journalism. I hope I pronounced those right. She previously taught media law and ethics at the JMSC University of Hong Kong. In fact, training an entire generation of journalists, as well as myself. Absolutely my favorite teacher, and has saved the asses of many a Hong Kong journalist since she literally wrote the book Hong Kong Media Law. Thanks for joining us, Doreen. Nice to see you.
Oh, good to see you again too, Tom.
Nice to see the Hong Kong skyline there.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, certainly you must be watching closely because the city has changed a lot just in the space of 3 weeks. You may have to frantically start rewriting that new edition of media law because since this law passed, the security law, we have seen a protest slogan made illegal,
Yes.
democracy books pulled from library shelves, a protest song banned in schools, a polling institution raided, and demonstrators arrested for wielding blank placards, let alone us media types scrambling to respond. What is your reaction watching this? I'm sure in somewhat horror from a.
Well, horror definitely for sure. So when I wrote my first and second edition of Hong Kong Media Law, so in 2007 for the first edition, 2014 for the second edition, I talked about a lot of troubling trends and issues that have been happening in Hong Kong, draconian defamation laws, what was happening on the privacy law front and so forth. But I concluded in both editions with this statement, which that no major new law had been enacted or passed in Hong Kong that would threaten press freedom in any strong way, and that no news organization had been shut down or censored for political reasons, and that if either of these things happened, at least we had the courts to depend on. I don't think I can say that anymore with my third edition of Hong Kong Media Law, which I'm now rewriting based on what has been happening with this new law that just went into effect just 2 weeks ago. Because we've now seen that this is a major law. This is in effect. It's not just a proposal. What's happening with RTHK as, the first example of being looked at and evaluated for its coverage of the protests and police violence toward protesters over the past year. The fact that one of its journalists asked the question of an official of the World Health Organization whether Taiwan should become a member of the WHO and how that might run afoul of this. And then the third point about whether the courts can do anything about this and whether or not they continue to support media. So I do think that this is indeed a watershed event in Hong Kong, that we will look at things in the future, 5-10 years from now, and look back at this as an important time where things definitely change and not for the better.
Well, you mentioned the courts there. Having spoken to some lawyers over the last week, I have to wonder, looking at some of the passages of the law, whether it's even worth taking some things to court, fighting, appealing, knowing that ultimately these things can face closed-door trials with hand-picked judges and could even be heard in the mainland. So is the rule of law completely undermined to the degree that should all lawyers just quit at this stage?
Well, I have to refer us back to a couple of my colleagues at Hong Kong U, at the University of Hong Kong at the law school. So Albert Chen and well as Simon Young, both have some optimism that at least we could try the initial cases through the courts, that there is some kind of judicial review of police action. So, for example, one of the aspects of the law, I think it came out in the implementation rules, is that police can ask, news media can ask the internet, ISPs, internet service providers, to remove content off of the internet, off of websites. And if someone doesn't comply with that they can face penalties. Well, many people think that you can go to court and you can challenge that. is that something that they can do? Now, ultimately, maybe at the end of the road, it might not have the result that you want, which is what you're referring to, that the ultimate decision, but maybe not every single thing will go through that. And Simon Young, who is at the law faculty, recently wrote an op-ed for the South China Morning Post, in which he talked about this, that we can't just kind of roll over, that we actually have to continue to try to hold up rule of law, to try to hold up the normal procedures, and hope that there might be some kind of give and take in which we could protect whatever freedoms we currently still have.
Well, you seem to touch on the idea of fight or flight when it comes to the media here. And certainly yesterday we learned that a third of the New York Times team are off already to Seoul. And I have a feeling they may not be the last to make the assessment and realize perhaps that Hong Kong isn't the bastion of press freedom it once was. If we zoom out a little bit, how do you view what Hong Kong's place in Asia was, its reputation now, and what the future may hold? Do you think other media outlets, this being a media hub, are going to follow suit?
Well, I think they're thinking about it, and I certainly know that they're currently contemplating what their exit plans might be if they need to do that. But at the same time, they also want to have a presence and in Hong Kong to cover what's actually happening. So in the New York Times case, they moved their digital staff away from Hong Kong, but they're keeping 2/3 of their staff there who are going to continue to cover the day-to-day issues and so on. Unfortunately, one of their reporters based in Hong Kong did not get his work permit renewed. And I think that's a big issue in terms of the weaponization of visas, which we know very much is part of what happens in mainland China. It's been using the visa permits as kind of the sort of amount keys over journalists. If they don't like what your content is, if they don't like what you're reporting about, then your visa is not renewed. And some of them get it renewed for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and therefore it's not being used. So that's the fear, that it will be used in Hong Kong. And we're already seeing some evidence of that. In 2018, even before this law was put in place, Victor Mallet, a British journalist from Financial Times, his visa was not renewed. And that was after, not something that he wrote about, not something that appeared in Financial Times, but because he hosted a panel that included a speaker with pro-independence views at the FCC when there was a panel of speakers there. And so we're going to see a lot more of that. So certainly media organizations are going to have to try to see what are their alternative plans. And I think that's a shame that they're going to have to do that. But there is some experience because they know how to operate in mainland China, where it's definitely more draconian there, and they still try to send journalists there. But again, that is a constant ongoing battle.
Certainly you look at media law across different jurisdictions, and before we zoom out to the whole world here and get depressing again, where do you recommend we all go? I mean, looking at I've been, looking at Singapore, Taiwan, everywhere it seems to have, some problematic features. Used to be Hong Kong people would come to.
I think that's probably the saddest thing for me. Hong Kong used to be known as this oasis of free speech in Asia. When I first came in the year 2000, and I was in Hong Kong for more than 15 years, we knew that we could use Hong Kong as a safe space, that people from different parts of the world who could come to China and come to our conferences. We were doing capacity building, training lawyers how to represent journalists, how to represent bloggers, and they didn't feel comfortable in their own countries. So we were able to bring in, for example, journalists from all over Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. And so Hong Kong is might not longer be that safe haven. I think Seoul is a place that more and more journalists might go to. Singapore has its problems, as you know, with its very strong proclivities for bringing defamation actions against journalists. Tokyo might be a place that some journalists might consider, but they also have instituted new national security laws and used to have much stronger freedom of information laws, and they don't have it as strong anymore. Taiwan, of course, but then there's that concern about whether you're in Taiwan and you're writing about what Taiwan is doing, that China may look askance at whatever it is that you're reporting because of the new long arm of this law, Article 38, which says that they can prosecute people beyond the jurisdiction anywhere in the world, particularly if you're not a resident of Hong Kong. So it's difficult to say where that might end up.
Great, that's depressing. Note to self, but wham! I'm going to come to America. That's the nearest.
Well, see, the thing is, there are problems in Asia. So, for example, in Malaysia, there was a recent case of 5 Australian journalists who work for Al Jazeera. They're being investigated and possibly going to be charged with sedition because they did a documentary about migrant workers during COVID-19. And so there's been ratcheting up throughout the region and around the world, quite frankly, of these issues and concerns.
Yeah, let's talk about some other places in the world. But first, I still, of course, want to ask. As you mentioned, this is a vague law. It's going to be broadly applied. We can see that already. It's very difficult to know what's going to be illegal, what won't be. We're probably not going to get answers to that. But there surely should be some advice, I suppose, to newsrooms, to journalists, to reporters in Hong Kong as to what we should be doing if we're going to keep calm, carry on, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I literally broke out the bike chains yesterday to secure our laptops and computers after we saw what happened at the polling institute around the corner from us.
Right.
Apart from draconian security theatre like that, what would you recommend now going forward? Obviously, no one wants to change their output or what they're reporting on.
Well, I do think the idea of what you do with your notes in Hong Kong would not be the first country to face this issue where you're securing your laptops and tying them down. But again, as you do your notes and so on, do you keep them for a long period of time? Or do you have a system of kind of destroying your notes as you go through? I do think overall that journalists should, and I think will, continue to vigorously report, as your organization has shown. You had this wonderful statement in the article that you wrote for The Guardian about it's your intention to continue to move forward and to do this, and it won't change your drive to cover this very, very important story in Hong Kong. And I think most journalists are going to do that as well. But I do think you have to be careful about who you do speak to. You have to be careful about protecting your sources because certainly any prosecution that might come out might not just go after you, but who you talk to. So you have to be careful about what you do with the information about your sources, how you can protect their identity, and so on. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. Because the law demands that you provide information, and so you have to be prepared to protect your sources. And I think that's an issue that journalists face all over the world, but I think you will see more and more here in Hong Kong, because up until this time, the case law indicated that that you could protect your sources, that a journalist would not be forced to have to reveal their sources. This law changes all of that.
Yeah, we've been having constant discussions internally about, upholding this commitment to face a jail sentence or a fine to protect sources. Otherwise, you're journalists. But it's funny to hear from you this advice sort of change about keeping notes, because I think under libel and defamation laws, you have always taught that we need to keep hold of them for like 7 years or something like that. And now it's
6 years. 6 years, right? Is the statute of limitations for defamation. But it's this is what this law does. It kind of changes that whole atmosphere, right? That before we were most concerned about civil defamation cases brought against you, and it was draconian in the sense that it brought all these, financial repercussions for both you and your organization. But now we're facing, prison time, and we're facing major fines, and also the routing out of your sources. So, times have to change. And again, I'm not saying destroy everything, and particularly after a prosecution starts, no. But you have to establish a policy of security for who you're speaking to, what kind of notes that you're taking, and how you're going to protect not just yourself, but your sources in the future. And I think that's something that every newsroom has to think about.
Okay, I'll be making friends with the shredder and bonfires every night at the office. Looking at you, will have surely pored over the wording of this law, and you'll be aware of, how it perhaps compares to other places in the world. How do a lot of countries have laws about terrorism, sedition, this kind of thing. It was treason back in the day, colonial times. How does it differ and compare to other places in the world?
Well, I think probably the biggest differences is how some of it is just not tied to specific acts or imminent danger or clear and present danger, right? It doesn't seem to have those standards attached to it. And then a lot of things are not defined, or not defined in traditional ways. So, for example, this idea of succession, right? So succession is someone who organizes, plans, commits, or participates, whether or not by force or threat of force, with a view to committing succession, or undermine national unification. It's again, these undefined terms. What is an act of terrorism? What is national security? A lot of things are not defined, and you don't have the kind of case law to look at. So that, I think, is probably one of the bigger issues and the biggest differences. And of course, anyone who has followed law in mainland China sees this over and over again, that they're done and written in intentionally vague ways, because it becomes elastic terms to apply to whatever the given situation. So, for example, state secrets, right? So that's a law that has tripped up many journalists, many individuals in China, but there's no generally recognized definition of what is a state secret. But we have found in cases that it involved everything from financial and security data, school exam results, information that's actually publicly available on the internet even, but yet this has been considered state secrets. So I think that's the biggest issue and the biggest differences among other countries.
You've had your eye on a few other cases. You wanted to talk about Russia, for instance, where there seems to be a new precedent there over how they've been pressuring some journalists.
Oh yeah. So just last week, a woman radio journalist was convicted for encouraging terrorism. And that was because she did a radio commentary about a young activist who blew himself up near a government building, and she linked it possibly to the political climate in Russia, and therefore had that issue as well. And then I think I was mentioning, in Malaysia, those Al Jazeera journalists from Australia who were being investigated for sedition. So, and then of course Turkey. Turkey has had many, many cases over the past few years of going after journalists who have interviewed someone who might be involved in terrorist activities or just an opposition group, and they're accused of propaganding and continuing the propaganda of terrorists and facing terrorism charges themselves. And there are more and more cases all along. So you're seeing this increasing around the world. And China seems to take it an extra step further, at least with this particular law. But again, we don't know how it plays out because it's so brand new.
Yeah, let's wrap up with one more question, I think, that is often on the lips of certainly the protest movement and a lot of Hong Kongers who
Yes.
no appetite really for the Great Firewall and using Chinese apps even. They will avoid. Can you see China extending the Great Firewall around Hong Kong? Is that going to happen? Particularly with so many tech companies saying that they're not going to cooperate with the authorities on this security law. Is the response going to be literally censoring the internet, taking down content?
Well, definitely the law allows some avenues to do this, where Article 43 and other aspects can demand that certain content be removed. But it doesn't define exactly what that content is, right? That police can order that. And if you don't, they have an imposition of penalties against those who don't. So what you might see is more internet and tech companies removing their servers out of Hong Kong, moving operations out of Hong Kong. Certainly right now, they're all questioning this and trying to evaluate. Will it turn into the Great Firewall that is in China? We certainly hope not, but there are some beginning tools that allow that to start to happen.
Oh boy. Well, thank you, Doreen.
I'm sorry to do that, and again, I'm hoping that things will not play out, because as we see cases, but I do want to say that I think and believe that Hong Kong journalists are among the bravest in the world, and including your news organization. And I think you'll continue to report in as vigorous a way as possible, because it's really an important story that has to be gotten out, not just to Hong Kongers, but to the rest of the world as well.
Thank you for that inspiring, flattering, and hopeful note. I appreciate that. Doreen Weisenhaus, saving the asses of Hong Kong journalists since the year 2000. How is the COVID situation there? Will you be able to visit anytime soon?
I'm sorry, visit Hong Kong, or
yeah.
you? I would love to. I would love to. And I don't have plans at immediate moment, but I do hope to come in and do some research. So sometime soon, and I will let you know.
Cool. Doreen is still the professor and director of the Media Law Project at the JMSC, so maybe we'll see her in town soon.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Doreen.
Yeah.
Goodbye for now.
Oh, my pleasure, and good luck with everything, Tom, and to all your staff.
Thanks.